In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains what happens when what you want doesn't happen in the world and how you can adjust to it.
We can zero it in a little bit more. There's been a lot of work on a brain area called the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is the part of the brain that moves information from short-term attention to long-term storage. It seems to do that across time. So, for example, if you suffer maybe impact-induced amnesia, a little bit of oxygen deprivation, the hippocampus was a very active part of the brain, and so it doesn't like being deprived of oxygen. And so if you have brain trauma and you get oxygen deprived, it'll damage the hippocampus. And then what often happens is you can't remember the accident. You can't remember what happened for 6 months before the accident. Your memory of the last 18 months is pretty hazy, but the farther back you go in time, the more likely you are to have access to the memories. So what seems to happen is the hippocampus it does a bunch of things. It moves, it probably organizes your autobiographical information initially, and then as it's elaborated in memory, it moves up into cortical representations and becomes more permanent. And maybe articulation has something to do with that. Like, I have a suspicion that partly what you're doing when you're doing the writing that you already did is you're moving information more and more permanently into cortical representation, cortical semantic representation. You're detaching it from its underlying emotional substrate. So the hippocampus seems to be responsible for that. So if you take people whose hippocampi, because there's 2 of them, have been destroyed, there are a few clinical case reports of people like that, they can't develop any new autobiographical memory. So the most famous of those patients was a guy named H.M. who had bilateral hippocampus damage, partly from surgery and partly from epilepsy, and he was stuck in like 1957 for 40 years. He couldn't even really recognize himself in a mirror because it was like the old him. And although he could learn new procedures quite well as a normal person, so he could learn a new procedure by practicing it day after day, but if you showed him the thing he'd learned, he'd say, I never saw that before, even though he got much better at it. And so he was one of the first cases that showed that memory systems were dissociable. So anyways, the hippocampus is a big deal. Now, the Russian neuropsychologists, Solikov and Vinogradova, followed by Jeffrey Gray, followed up on this cybernetic model via Luria, and they came up with the hypothesis that what the hippocampus was doing was comparing what you expected to happen in the world with what was happening. Okay, so it's an expectation-based model. The idea was, because they were behaviorists, the idea was there are stimuli in the world, they're actually there, you're monitoring them, you have a sense of what's going to happen, which is a cognitive expectation, and as long as the 2 things are co-occurring, then your emotions, particularly your threat response, is inhibited. So the threat system is sort of always on, but as long as everything is happening the way you expect it to happen, then it's inhibited. Now the way it's inhibited, it seems to be, it's something like this. There's a part of the brain that's very deep called the reticular activating system, and the reticular activating system is an ascending stream of neuronal connections. And if you're in a car accident and you twist your head and you snap that tract, because it's actually fairly fragile, then you're unconscious forever, and that's that. So it's very, very important tract, and it seems to be governing arousal. It's what governs your emergence into consciousness and your descent into unconsciousness at night. Very, very, very old brain system. And what it seems to happen is if the hippocampus detects a mismatch, it's tonically inhibiting the reticular activating system. So as long as everything is going according to expectation, the reticular activating system isn't sending a message to the amygdala and other systems that are primarily associated with emotion. It's not sending a signal to them saying, wake the hell up. But as soon as there's a mismatch, then the hippocampal inhibition of the reticular activating system declines, and the amygdala and other emotional systems, motivational systems as well, turn on. So, or are no longer inhibited, which is a better way of thinking about it. Okay, so now, when Gray, who is also one of the cybernetic theorists, talks about what happens when you hit something that's unexpected, he basically says you have to revamp your motor programs and your expectations of the future in order to reconcile the error. And that's a complex process and it requires exploration. But the problem with that theory is you don't have access to the present. You have a model of the present. And you don't expect things to happen, you want them to happen. And so what that means is if they don't happen the way you want them to, you have a bigger problem than the cognitive cybernetic theorists originally envisioned. And the problem is, the place where the error might be is way bigger. It might be in what you want, it might be in how you put together what you want with the other things you want, it might be how you put together all those things with what other people want, it might be something wrong with your conception of your abilities at the present time, it might be a skill deficit, and it might be something that's gone astray with your conceptualization of the future. That's a big search space. And so that's part of the reason. So you might say, well, what should you do when you hit something you don't expect? And the answer to that is, you default to emergency preparation. Now, how much do you default? Well, we don't quite understand the representation yet because it's associated with this hierarchical problem we already described. So I think it's got to be something like this. Your brain must be able to tell somehow how much of its structure is dependent on the viability of a given node. So imagine that you have a representation and hardly anything depends on that representation. And then that representation is disrupted. It's like, yeah, that's no big deal because it's only knocking out a part of what you're using to orient yourself in the world. But if it's a fundamental presupposition, maybe like the continued presence of a loved one, on which all your other plans are predicated, because you can imagine that sort of as a neural structure. If it's way down at the bottom and the neural structure is branching off from that, and that gets disrupted, it looks like the hippocampal septal system has some ability to sense the degree to which a given conceptualization is fundamental. And maybe that has something to do with how early in life it was laid down. You know, because you know that once you make a presupposition in childhood to orient yourself, then other more finely grained presuppositions are going to emerge from that. So maybe it has something to do with depth of representation in the brain, like, or the branching, or the count of the branches that come off that. I don't know, and I don't think anybody does. But there has to be an association of that sort. Yep.